Thank you all very much for coming out this evening and spending this evening with us to go over this very important information. Welcome to this community forum on the financial forecast for your Columbus City Schools. On behalf of the Columbus Board of Education, thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your thoughts and concerns and hopefully your constructive ideas. The members of the Board of Education had a previously scheduled special meeting tonight, so they are unable to join us in person. But we will be capturing the feedback you provide us tonight and sharing that information with them at a later date. As you all know, they are juggling several things at this time and several important, very important issues at this time. The start of tonight's meeting is also being streamed on Facebook Live, so more of our community members can follow along with us this evening. Let me start by saying that every investment we make as a district is valuable, and behind the dollar signs are the faces of our more than 51,000 students and 9,000 team members across the district. These conversations about potential budget reductions are not meant to discredit the value of any person or program. I would like to keep them all, but instead we recognize that priorities must be set when the state fails to provide full funding for our operations. I hope you appreciate that our process has been data-driven and respectful, and that we are here tonight with open minds and a willingness to have constructive conversations about our future. To begin, I will ask our District Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer, Stan Behort, to run through the numbers of the financial forecast to help us all better understand how we got to this point tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to Treasurer Behort.
Thank you, Dr. Stanford. Good evening. This presentation is one that I delivered to the Board of Education back on January 30th at a special board meeting that they held on this very topic. And my goal this evening is to fairly quickly bring you forward from 2016 when we were planning for an operating levy and some of the assumptions that we made about our revenue forecast, and then had prepared several updates to those forecasts over time up to this point. Back at the time we were planning for the levy, we made two very important assumptions. One, that the November operating levy would pass, and number two, that the cap on state funding would increase at a rate at plus 7.5% per year, as it had been increasing during the most recent biennium. So we assumed that that would continue on in the next biennium and thereafter in the forecast. As we moved through 2016, one of those assumptions came true when the voters of the district approved the operating levy. We then updated our forecast in December of 16 to reflect that. But in January and February of 2017, as the state began to consider their biennium, the current biennium that we are in, we began to hear rumblings that the cap increase would not be 7.5%, but at that time we heard it would be lower at approximately 5%. The May forecast in 16 was then adjusted to reflect that change in cap growth, but unfortunately several months later, when the biennium budget was actually set, it came in at plus 4%. So if you can imagine 5 years compounded at plus 7.5 versus 5 years compounded at 4%, that had a dramatic impact. And it is that change, that assumption that did not come true, which is the major driver of where we are today. The October 17 forecast, which projects out to fiscal year 21-22, is right here. And this is the cash balance, and as you can see, our expenditures exceed revenues for the 5 years of the forecast, and we end up with a projected deficit of about $224 million. So with that deficit looming, the administration set about the process of considering what we might have to do in order to address that deficit. And keep in mind that the sooner we begin to address the deficit, I'll say easier, although all of this is very difficult to do. But from a numbers standpoint, what you do now translates into 4 or 5 years of savings rather than waiting 3 or 4 years to try to address the entire $224 million all at one time. So in keeping with I believe, several directives from the Board of Education, one of them being that we would attempt to not impact the classroom as much as possible, that we would avoid as best we can being on the ballot before 2020, and that we would keep our levy promises for the addition of staff that we made back in the 2016 levy. With that in mind, that left us with expenditure reductions to consider. As we set about looking at expenditure reductions, just to organize our thoughts, we used a matrix. Fairly simple here, and evaluated these expenditure reductions on the basis of, are they required or not required? And that required could be the basis of state law, it could be federal law, it could be board policy. It could be things that the board really wants to do. They're saying, well, they are required, but this isn't required. So that definition really is in the eye of the beholder. The other side of the matrix is return on that investment. And that's both a quantitative return as well as a qualitative return. So as the administration sat down and looked at our budget line items, we used this as a mechanism to evaluate and perhaps categorize or prioritize some of the reductions that we might consider. And so as you can see, I think it's fairly straightforward that if there are line items that we're required to do and our return on investment is high, it's fairly easy to say, well, we should keep that. And if it's not required and our return on investment is very low, well, obviously that might be termed the low-hanging fruit, and that should go. Certainly not a perfect mechanism for evaluating them, and maybe not fully complete, but it was one way to organize our thoughts to get started. So we go back to our forecast. And I just wanted to point out, I did this for the board and remind everyone when we do a forecast that 0 is not our ending target balance. Best practices said that we should have about 30 days operating cash. So in any financial planning, we really should plan for about 80 million ending cash at any one point in time. So as you can see, while it's indicating a $224 million deficit, actually for against our target, it's more like 304 million. During the process of evaluating some of the expenditure reductions, you might recall that the federal government was on the brink of shutting down, and they passed a continuing resolution to keep the federal government operating. And in that continuing resolution was a delay in the Cadillac tax. This is part of the Affordable Care Act, and it's a tax on the health care program that they deem to be a high-value program, and therefore a Cadillac tax. And so that brought us up, we gained about $12 million from that, bringing that deficit projection up to about $212 million. The next thing that we could take into consideration is that we often talk about our conservative forecasting, and we like to be conservative. And what that means on the revenue side is that we like to generally have actuals come in above our estimates. It's always good to estimate a little bit low. You don't want to create recurring expenses out of non-recurring income. So you tend to underestimate revenue a bit, and actuals come in above. On the expenditure side, you would rather make the other error, that is expenses you estimate to be a little bit higher, and they come in a little bit lower. Both of those working together generate positive cash flow. We made an estimate of that, and while we might not include it in the actual forecast document, as we all worked through this expenditure process, we added that back in at about $15 million a year, so we pick up about $60 million there, which brings now the deficit to deal with, at least on a cash basis, of $152 million. So we evaluated the reductions. There were many line items that were considered that you'll see here on all the charts this evening, but we came up with a list that amounted to approximately $21 million worth of recommended or proposed tentative draft. Nothing has been decided, but this is what the administration came up with as a list of possible reductions. And when we get to there, we see that that $21 million, coupled with all the other adjustments and factors that we would be willing to include in this process, brings us to a deficit of about $68 million. Keep in mind that with the $80 million target, there would be, absent any other action by the board, there would still be about $148 million to address by 21-22. But between now and then, several things are on the horizon. Most notable is the election that's coming up for the legislature and the governor, and whether or not that changes the outlook for K-12 education. And we may see a more favorable biennial budget that might yield more than 4%, but I'm not sure that we can count on that. I would note that there was an editorial in the Columbus Dispatch that suggested that we be more conservative in our revenue estimate, that +4 may not be the right number to use, but as you can imagine, if we lower that estimate from 4% to say 2%, the deficit projected only gets worse. That brings you up to where we are today and why we're considering the reductions. Briefly in the assumptions, we tried to meet the board priorities relative to no levy until 2020. Keep the FTE that we promised in that levy. That was 325.2, I believe, over a 5-year period. We're into that, so far 2 years into that, and to minimize the impact on academic programming. During this time, we've made no change in the revenue assumptions about that we used in the October forecast, so we still assume state revenue at +4%. The Cadillac tax, we assume, remains in effect. We've learned that the federal government can give and then they can turn around and take away. So we're assuming that that will stay into effect into the future. That our conservative forecast actually will yield positive cash flow of about $15 million per year, and that our reductions that we do that are proposed for fiscal year 19 will remain in force for the life of the forecast through fiscal year 2022, and that we really would prefer to have and meet our 30-day cash balance target. Those are the major assumptions. That's how they impacted our forecast and how we arrived at this deficit situation, how we ran through all the line items for consideration and arrived at this recommended list. And I think at this time I'll turn it back to Dr. Stanford.
Okay. So tonight, this is your opportunity to talk with members of our district leadership team who worked on the potential budget reductions that you will see tonight. The potential budget reductions that you will see tonight would potentially take effect as part of the 2018-2019 school year. Again, as you know, reductions of this magnitude are never a one-cut-fits-all solution. But overall, our team grouped these proposed reductions around 3 action items. First, we look for opportunities where we could reduce costs but not eliminate certain supports for our students. There are several initiatives, especially within academic services and in our administrative offices, where funding would be cut by 50% or more starting next school year. Those specific activities and district-wide supports would still be offered, yet they would receive dramatically reduced district investment. Second, we identified a number of district-level responsibilities and staffing positions which could reallocate back to the school building level. From covering the extra costs of field trips and lunchroom monitors to provide media technology support in the classroom, the district will now look to principals to identify resources within their building teams and budgets to account for these type of needs in our buildings. Third, there are several proposed reductions that realign many of our operational services to minimal levels and realign certain academic offerings to reflect state-mandated requirements. To be clear, in a budget predominantly driven by personnel expenses, which is about 85% of our general revenue fund, reductions of this magnitude will certainly impact personnel numbers district-wide. So, you will see more than 160 proposed FTE reductions. This is a combination of certificated, classified, and administrative positions. And our hope is that a significant number would be handled through normal attrition. We know that $21 million in proposed reductions would have an impact on the district services to our students and be felt in every school and neighborhood across the city. Still, we need to have these conversations to maintain our fiscal stability. We must be good fiscal stewards of the resources that we have available to us for the community. And tonight, we want to hear from you. We want to answer your questions and to provide some clarity on the proposed reductions. And we want to enlist your help and get your insights this evening. Throughout the night, our team will ask if there are alternative ways in which we could still accomplish the same outcomes, but perhaps we do it in a more efficient and cost-effective way, based on your feedback. And we'll ask if you can think of any additional everyday savings that could come by implementing either in the classroom at a different way or at the building level or district-wide in a different way. In a moment, I'll invite you to join our breakout sessions where you can learn more and provide feedback. Also know that in each of the breakout session rooms, there are these posters on the wall that show you the proposed reductions that we are making as a part of this process. You will also see those items that we considered but did not make as a recommendation for our proposed reduction list. Now, to give you some more information about the breakout sessions, we would like to break out into 3 different rooms. It is up to you which room you would like to go to. During the transition phase, we hope to have everybody into their identified rooms by 6:25, 6:30, okay? The first breakout room will be for our academic services. Leading our session on proposed reductions in academic services will be our Chief Academic Officer, Alicia Gillison. That breakout session will be in the cafeteria where we are currently located. Next, to answer your questions about our district operations and our accountability office, including questions about transportation, building services, and school choice, that conversation will be led by our Chief Operations Officer, Maurice Oldham, and our Chief Accountability Officer, Dr. Michelle Klein. That conversation will be in room 109, down the hall. Finally, all other proposed reductions will be addressed by our Budget Director, Scott Gooding. Stand up. We will try to answer your questions in that room for board services, budget management, communications, WCBE, legal services, and the offices of the treasurer, the superintendent, and internal auditor. And all other district-wide services will be in this final room. The conversation for those different offices will be in room 105. You do not need to stay in one room. You are free to go from one conversation to the next one, depending on what your interests are. If you are not able to share your thoughts tonight, or you have an idea or a concern that comes to you later, please make sure to share your feedback either online, on our app, on the phone, through email, or snail mail, or in person if possible. We've given everyone here tonight information on how to share your input on these budget conversations with that little flyer that was given to you at the door. We definitely encourage you to use those different vehicles in order to share your ideas and your insights with us, even after this session tonight. So with that, we will have a short break to give you time to find the conversation room you are most interested in. And again, on behalf of our Board of Education, thank you for being here tonight to share your voice and your feedback in this very important process.